Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that in the span of just 48 hours, we witnessed the most dramatic geopolitical reversal of the 21st century, where the world's most powerful military superpower backed down from its closest neighbor, not through force, but through the quiet, methodical application of geographic reality? And ask yourself this: when has America ever publicly retreated from a territorial demand without a single shot being fired, without economic collapse, and without internal political uprising forcing their hand? For weeks, the world watched in stunned silence as President Donald Trump escalated his rhetoric about Greenland from wishful thinking to outright threats of military force. He imposed tariffs on 8 NATO allies, threatened to use economic coercion against Denmark, and spoke openly about deploying American forces to seize an Arctic territory belonging to one of America's oldest democratic allies. The international order seemed to be fracturing in real time. European leaders spoke of the end of NATO, financial markets plunged, and yet, by January 21st, 2026, Trump was standing in Davos, Switzerland, announcing what he called a framework of a future deal, backing away from military threats and canceling the punitive tariffs he had promised to impose. This was not just a policy reversal. This was a geopolitical capitulation disguised as negotiation. But here is what most people do not realize. This stunning about-face had nothing to do with American magnanimity or European diplomatic pressure. It had everything to do with a cold calculation that the Arctic belongs to those who understand its geography. And Canada has just proven that we are the true masters of the North. To understand how we arrived at this moment of American retreat, we must look beyond the headlines and examine the geographic chess game that has been playing out across the top of the world for the past 2 years, a game where Canada holds all the winning pieces. Before we dive deeper into this Arctic power play, if you are finding this perspective on geopolitical strategy valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to produce detailed analysis of the forces reshaping our world. Let us start with the fundamental misunderstanding that led Trump to this embarrassing retreat. America's approach to the Arctic has always been that of an outside power looking in. Despite Alaska giving them a northern coastline, the United States has never truly grasped the integrated nature of Arctic geography. They see Greenland as an isolated island to be possessed, not as part of a comprehensive northern system that Canada has been quietly building for decades. While Trump was tweeting threats about Greenland, Canada was implementing the most sophisticated Arctic strategy in the world. Since 2019, Ottawa has invested over $38.6 billion in NORAD modernization, Arctic patrol ships, and northern infrastructure. But the true genius of Canadian Arctic policy lies not in what we built, but where we built it. Every Canadian Arctic installation, every port facility, every radar station has been positioned to create an integrated defensive network that makes any hostile action in the Arctic logistically impossible without Canadian cooperation. Consider the geographic reality that Trump's advisors apparently failed to explain to him. Greenland is not some isolated chunk of ice floating in the middle of nowhere. It sits at the center of a maritime system that Canada controls at every choke point. Any ship approaching Greenland from the Atlantic must pass through waters where Canadian naval assets can monitor and intercept them. Any aircraft flying to Greenland must pass through airspace covered by Canadian radar systems and patrolled by Canadian fighters based in the Arctic archipelago. Most critically, any attempt to supply a major military operation in Greenland would require passage through the Northwest Passage, which Canada has been steadily fortifying for the past 5 years. The Americans learned the hard way what every Canadian military strategist has known for decades. You cannot project power into the Arctic without controlling the logistical routes, and Canada controls those routes completely. This geographic stranglehold became painfully obvious to American planners when they began serious contingency planning for Greenland operations in late 2025. Pentagon sources, speaking anonymously to defense publications, revealed that every war game scenario for securing Greenland resulted in the same conclusion. Without Canadian cooperation, any American military operation would be starved of supplies within weeks. The distances are too vast, the weather too unpredictable, and the Canadian-controlled choke points too numerous to bypass. But geography alone does not explain Trump's retreat. The real story lies in how Canada used that geographic advantage to build an alliance structure that made American ambitions in Greenland politically unsustainable. This is where Prime Minister Mark Carney demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that transforms middle powers into great powers. Instead of confronting American threats directly, which would have played into Trump's narrative of American strength versus Canadian weakness, Carney orchestrated what can only be described as a diplomatic masterpiece. He used Canada's geographic position to position ourselves as the indispensable partner for Arctic security, not just for NATO, but for the global community interested in Arctic stability. The turning point came in early January 2026, when Carney made a seemingly routine announcement about expanding Operation Nanook, Canada's premier Arctic military exercise. What appeared to be a modest increase in training activity was actually a stroke of strategic genius. Carney invited not just traditional allies like Denmark, Norway, and the United Kingdom, but also neutral countries like Sweden and Finland, and even Arctic Council observers like France and Germany. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Canada was positioning itself as the convener and coordinator of Arctic security, not as a junior partner to American power projection. When these nations accepted Canadian invitations and began deploying forces to participate in Canadian-led exercises in the Arctic, they were making a statement about where they saw the center of Arctic leadership residing. Trump's response was predictably hostile. He threatened tariffs against any nation that participated in military exercises near Greenland without American approval, but this threat revealed the fundamental weakness of his position. He was essentially demanding that NATO allies choose between cooperation with America and cooperation with Canada in the Arctic. For European nations facing Russian threats to their east and Chinese economic pressure from multiple directions, this was an easy choice. They chose the ally that offered partnership over the one that offered ultimatums. The Danish response was particularly telling. Instead of cowering before American threats, Denmark leaned into its Arctic responsibilities. Danish forces increased their presence in Greenland, but they did so in coordination with Canadian Arctic command structures. When German, French, and British forces deployed to Greenland for winter exercises, they did so using logistics chains that ran through Canadian Arctic bases. Every European soldier that set foot in Greenland was a reminder to Washington that Arctic operations require Canadian cooperation. But the most brilliant aspect of Carney's strategy was how he used Canada's relationship with Greenland's indigenous population to completely outflank American ambitions. While Trump was talking about Greenland as if it were empty real estate to be purchased, Canada was deepening its cultural and economic ties with Greenlandic communities through Arctic Council initiatives and indigenous partnership programs. Canadian Arctic expertise became indispensable to anyone serious about operating in Greenland. Our experience with Arctic construction, our understanding of permafrost engineering, our knowledge of Arctic logistics, and most importantly, our relationships with indigenous communities across the Arctic made us the natural partner for anyone seeking to develop sustainable operations in the region. When Greenlandic political leaders began speaking out against American annexation threats, they consistently pointed to Canada as an example of how Arctic nations should behave. They praised Canadian respect for Indigenous sovereignty, Canadian environmental stewardship, and Canadian approaches to Arctic development that prioritize local communities over extractive industries. This created an impossible situation for American policymakers. Any aggressive move toward Greenland would not only face European opposition and Canadian logistical barriers, but would also be seen as an assault on Indigenous rights by the very people they claimed to be protecting from Russian and Chinese influence. The economic dimension of Canada's Arctic strategy proved equally decisive. While Trump was threatening military action, Canada was quietly building the economic infrastructure that makes Arctic operations viable. The expansion of Churchill Port, the development of Arctic shipping routes, and the creation of Indigenous-led Arctic economic development initiatives provided a model for sustainable Arctic development that stood in stark contrast to American threats of annexation. European and Danish businesses looking to invest in Greenlandic development found Canadian partners who understood Arctic operations and who had relationships with the communities where they wanted to work. Canadian engineering firms won contracts for Greenlandic infrastructure projects. Canadian logistics companies developed supply chains for Arctic operations. Canadian financial institutions created investment vehicles for sustainable Arctic development. By the time Trump began making serious threats about Greenland, Canada had already become the indispensable economic partner for anyone seeking to do business in the Arctic. American annexation of Greenland would not just face military and political obstacles, but would also destroy the economic relationships that make modern Arctic development possible. I want to pause here and ask you a critical question. Do you believe Trump's advisors understood the depth of Canadian Arctic integration, or were they caught off guard by the sophistication of our northern strategy? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective on great power miscalculation helps us understand how these strategic surprises develop. The intelligence dimension of this story reveals just how thoroughly Canada has penetrated the Arctic security environment. Through our participation in NORAD, our leadership in the Arctic Council, and our relationships with northern communities, Canada has developed what can only be described as total situational awareness across the Arctic region. Let us examine the concrete reality of this intelligence supremacy. Canada operates a network of over 47 northern warning stations, stretching from the Aleutian Islands to Baffin Island. These installations provide coverage of Arctic air and sea approaches that no other nation can match. Our new over-the-horizon radar system, scheduled for initial operation by 2030, will provide detection capabilities reaching deep into the Arctic Ocean, far beyond what any Greenland-based American facility could achieve. Canadian intelligence services monitor Russian Arctic activities from bases that provide better coverage than anything the Americans could establish in Greenland. Our understanding of Chinese Arctic ambitions comes from tracking their activities across multiple Arctic regions, not just from a single forward position. Our relationships with indigenous communities provide human intelligence networks that no outside power can duplicate. The sophistication of Canada's Arctic intelligence network became apparent during the Chinese spy balloon incident of 2023. Canadian NORAD installations detected and tracked the balloon long before it entered American airspace. Our Arctic radar network provided continuous tracking data that allowed for optimal interception timing. American officials publicly acknowledged that without Canadian detection capabilities, the balloon might have completed its entire mission undetected. Furthermore, Canada's participation in the Arctic Council gives us access to intelligence about Arctic activities from all circumpolar nations. We maintain cooperative intelligence relationships with Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Sweden, and even limited cooperation with Russia on matters of Arctic safety and environmental monitoring. The economic intelligence dimension of our Arctic capabilities proved equally decisive in forcing Trump's retreat. Canadian firms operating in the Arctic have developed detailed knowledge of resource potential, development costs, and logistical requirements that took decades to accumulate. When American officials began serious planning for Greenland development following potential annexation, they discovered that the learning curve for Arctic operations is measured in decades, not months. When NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte met with Trump in Davos, he was armed with intelligence assessments that demonstrated Canada's centrality to Arctic security. Any framework for Arctic security had to be built around Canadian capabilities, Canadian relationships, and Canadian geographic advantages. The Americans could choose to be part of that framework, or they could be excluded from it, but they could not replace it. This intelligence reality made Trump's position untenable. American military planners were forced to admit that seizing Greenland would actually decrease American Arctic security capabilities because it would destroy the cooperative relationships that make comprehensive Arctic monitoring possible. Better to have a smaller role in a Canadian-led Arctic security framework than to have a larger role in a compromised and contested Arctic environment. The final factor that forced Trump's retreat was the emerging economic cost of his Arctic adventurism. Financial markets began pricing in the risks of a NATO crisis caused by American threats against Denmark. European investment in American markets began to decline as uncertainty about American reliability increased. Most damaging of all, American companies with Arctic operations began lobbying against policies that would destroy their relationships with Canadian and European partners. The real genius of Canada's position was that we never had to threaten retaliation or economic warfare. We simply had to continue doing what we were already doing, building cooperative relationships, and developing sustainable Arctic capabilities, while American threats made their position increasingly untenable. By January 2026, Trump faced a choice between escalating toward a crisis that would destroy NATO, wreck American relationships with European allies, and eliminate American influence in Arctic affairs, or finding a face-saving way to retreat from his untenable position. The framework deal, announced after his meeting with Rutte, provided exactly that face-saving mechanism. But let us be clear about what this framework actually represents. It is not a compromise between American and European positions. It is a codification of Canadian Arctic leadership disguised as a multilateral agreement. The framework commits NATO allies to Arctic security cooperation, but that cooperation will be coordinated through existing structures where Canada plays the leading role. The specific details of this framework reveal the extent of Canada's victory. Under the agreement announced by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Arctic security operations will be coordinated through the existing Canadian-led Joint Task Force North Headquarters in Yellowknife. Canadian Arctic patrol vessels will provide the backbone of NATO Arctic maritime security. Canadian Arctic airfields will serve as the primary bases for Allied air operations in the region. Most significantly, the framework establishes Canada as the lead nation for NATO Arctic intelligence coordination. This means that all intelligence about Russian and Chinese Arctic activities will be processed through Canadian facilities and shared through Canadian-controlled networks. American intelligence agencies will receive Arctic intelligence briefings from Canadian sources, reversing the traditional flow of information from south to north. American participation in this framework will be welcome, but it will be participation in a Canadian-led system, not American domination of a Canadian subsidiary. Trump's threats have succeeded in one thing. They have formalized Canada's position as the leader of Western Arctic policy. The logistical arrangements under the framework are even more revealing of Canadian dominance. All NATO Arctic operations will be supplied through Canadian Arctic ports and airfields. Allied forces operating in the Arctic will depend on Canadian supply chains, Canadian transportation networks, and Canadian emergency services. Any allied nation wanting to operate in the Arctic will need Canadian approval, Canadian support, and Canadian cooperation. The broader implications of this Arctic victory extend far beyond the immediate Greenland crisis. Canada has demonstrated that middle power countries can use geographic advantages and alliance building to constrain superpower behavior. We have shown that strategic patience and comprehensive planning can overcome rhetorical intimidation and military threats. The technological implications of Canada's Arctic victory are particularly significant for the future of northern development. Canada's leadership in Arctic technology development, from ice-capable vessels to permafrost construction techniques, has established us as the essential partner for any serious Arctic operation. The Canadian government's recent announcement of the $2.92 million partnership with Telesat and MDA Space for Arctic satellite communications demonstrates our commitment to technological leadership in the North. Most importantly, we have proven that the Arctic belongs to those who understand it, respect it, and work with its people. American attempts to impose outside control on the Arctic ran up against the reality that the Arctic is not empty territory waiting to be colonized. It is a region with its own communities, its own interests, and its own strategic logic. The economic development model pioneered by the Arctic Gateway Group, which manages the port of Churchill under Indigenous ownership, has become the gold standard for sustainable Arctic development. This model, which combines commercial viability with Indigenous sovereignty and environmental protection, attracts international investment and support in ways that extractive colonial approaches cannot match. The Northwest Passage, as it becomes increasingly navigable, will require sophisticated management to balance commercial shipping with environmental protection and Indigenous interests. Canada's experience managing these competing interests through inclusive governance structures gives us unique capabilities for managing increased Arctic shipping traffic. Canada's victory in this crisis establishes us as the indispensable Arctic power for the 21st century. Our geographic position, our alliance relationships, our Indigenous partnerships, and our strategic patience have combined to create a northern fortress that no outside power can challenge successfully. The financial markets have already recognized the implications of Canada's Arctic victory. Canadian companies involved in Arctic operations have seen significant increases in their stock values, as international investors recognize the stability and profitability of working with the established Arctic leader rather than against it. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the Greenland crisis are clear. The Arctic will be secured through cooperation, not conquest. It will be developed through partnership with northern communities, not through the imposition of outside priorities. And it will be led by nations that understand that true power in the Arctic comes not from the ability to seize territory, but from the wisdom to build sustainable relationships. Friends, we have witnessed something truly remarkable in the past weeks. We have seen a superpower forced to retreat not by military defeat or economic collapse, but by the quiet, patient application of geographic reality and sophisticated diplomatic strategy. We have seen Canada emerge as the true master of the Arctic, not through aggressive expansion, but through thoughtful integration and respectful partnership. This is what victory looks like in the modern 21st century. Not the conquest of territory, but the building of comprehensive systems. Not the domination of opponents, but the creation of frameworks where cooperation becomes the only logical and viable choice. Canada has not just won a significant diplomatic victory over the Greenland crisis. We have established ourselves as the defining power of the Arctic century that lies ahead. The world is taking notice. When middle powers can use geography and diplomacy to constrain superpower behavior, the entire international system becomes more stable and more just. Canada's Arctic strategy provides a comprehensive model for how responsible nations can build lasting security through cooperative partnership rather than through military domination and territorial conquest. As we move forward, we must remember that this victory was not achieved through luck or accident. It was the result of decades of strategic thinking, careful relationship building, and patient development of our comprehensive northern capabilities. Our Arctic victory is definitive proof that Canada, when we apply ourselves with determination, wisdom, and unity, can be a leading power on the world stage. If you are finding this analysis of Canada's strategic triumph valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more detailed content. Your support helps us continue bringing you in-depth analysis of the geopolitical forces that are fundamentally reshaping our world. The ice may be melting in the Arctic, but Canada's strategic position there has never been stronger. We are the masters of the North, the guardians of Arctic, and the leaders of a new comprehensive model of international cooperation based on respect and partnership. The Greenland crisis is over, and Canada has emerged victorious. Thank you.